This is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. It is February the 28th, 2024, leap year. One more day of February, and then we're on to March, and it's Oscar season. Strong year this year for the Oscars. It's in a couple of weeks. And of course, the movie that everyone continues to talk about and suggest should win the best movie of the year is Oppenheimer. The Guardian believes it's the best film of the year. Most of the bookmakers and odds makers are predicting that Oppenheimer is poised to have what pundits call a big night at the Oscars in a couple of weeks. It's already won as a movie the Producers Guild Award. It's an interesting film. I actually just traveled back from Washington, D.C. yesterday, and everyone on the plane was watching it. And I wonder whether, in a way, it's become popular and people are comfortable with it. Oscars, of course, a very mainstream thing because it presents nuclear power, nuclear weapons as a closed thing, as something historical. But of course, nuclear weapons are anything but historical. They continue to threaten the future of the world. As my guest today, Sarah Scoles, a Colorado-based science reporter, journalist, has analyzed and shown in an important new book, Countdown, the blinding future of nuclear weapons rather than the past of nuclear weapons. Sarah is focusing on its future, and she is joining us from Colorado today. Sarah, do you think, I assume you've seen Oppenheimer, do you think that people are comfortable with it because it's presented as kind of dead history?
Yeah, I think that has a lot to do with its popularity. And I also think, the movie is a little bit removed from the human effects of actually using nuclear weapons, which can also make people more comfortable if they're not seeing hundreds of thousands of other people dying. But yeah, Oppenheimer presents the nuclear project as safely in the past and as something that a really limited group of people accomplished, when really it's a big part of our world now and still involves thousands of people today. Well, actually, I mean, it involves all of us today when you get right down to it.
So you're not just a historian of nuclear weapons, but a futurist as well. Is it an accurate film, do you think? Does it deal with the origins of the American nuclear bomb fairly, or is it biased in some way?
I mean, to my understanding of Oppenheimer as a person in his trial and the way the Manhattan Project played out, it's accurate. I would say that the biases that I've seen are that it is a movie about this one man who was the head of this part of the Manhattan Project, and not about other facilities that worked on it or the effects on, the people of Japan or even the people of New Mexico who were affected by, for instance, the Trinity test of the first nuclear weapon.
It deals, as you suggest, with the moral questions around the development of the bomb, particularly associated with Oppenheimer and, as you say, his elite group of physicists, of nuclear scientists, and Albert Einstein and other scientific notables. Is that the right way? I mean, your book kind of takes a different angle, looking at today's workers who aren't quite as glamorous or as intellectually or academically distinguished as Oppenheimer and Einstein. Is that simply because the technology now is mainstream? Or could there be another narrative of a more democratic way of thinking about even the origins of the bomb?
Yeah, I mean, I think that my book, the nuclear weapons complex of today involves a number of people who are just kind of they're doing their daily jobs, and there isn't any one single hero or villain of the story either way. And I think that that's partly a function of how science has progressed since the 1940s. Like you did used to have people who made discoveries kind of on their own or in a more one person sort of way, and everything is kind of interdisciplinary and involves a large team of scientists now. But I think, I think the figure for the number of people who worked on the Manhattan Project was around or more than 100,000 people across the country. So I think there is also a more democratic way that you could present the way that even that first project played out.
Perhaps a book, Sarah, by you or somebody else. In
Yeah.
terms of the technology, I've often wondered about this. One of the central themes in Oppenheimer is the disagreement between Oppenheimer and Edward Teller about developing the technology, whether to develop the thermonuclear weapon, which Oppenheimer was uncomfortable with. Teller, Hungarian-based physicist or Hungarian-born physicist, was more enthusiastic, certainly someone violently hostile to the Soviet Union. How much has nuclear technology developed since not just Oppenheimer's bomb, but Teller's thermonuclear bomb?
Mm-hmm. I mean, a lot of the details of the specifics of what's new about nuclear weapons are classified, so I don't know that I can speak to all the technical specifications that are in there. But I mean, the basic physics of how our nuclear weapons work are not very different from the thermonuclear bomb that Teller and his team helped develop. There's a core in the center that begins fission, the splitting of atoms that then sets off a fusion reaction of even more energy. And that's essentially the same thing that happens in our modern nuclear weapons today, even if some of their components are different in ways that we don't totally have access to.
Well, you probably have more access, certainly intellectually, than others. Is there then no kind of Moore's law when it comes to nuclear technology? When we compare even the iPhones we carry around in our pockets to the supercomputers of the 70s or 80s, the technology has dramatically become more powerful. Is that not true of nuclear weapons?
I don't know that anyone has tried to enact a Moore's law of nuclear weapons.
I'm not
They
suggesting they should, but given the power of computers these days, one would have guessed that the Americans or the Russians or the Chinese would have developed a single bomb, for example, that could destroy the entire world, given how much technology in other spheres has progressed over the last 70 or 80 years.
I mean, I think the kind of the fundamental problem with going for something like that is that for nuclear deterrence to work, which is this idea that, I have a bomb, you have a bomb, you won't attack me because I could retaliate against you with my bomb, that relies on nuclear weapons being usable and for people to believe that you would be willing to use them. And if you have a bomb that just automatically destroys the world on its own or even a significant portion of it, it's harder for people to believe, I think, that you would actually
Yeah, or
push,
there are
push the
probably
button.
terrorists might, certain kinds of
Mhm.
terrorists might like at least the threat of that kind of bomb. So, Sarah, is the history of nuclear weapons really since Oppenheimer and Teller, those elite scientists who developed the bomb in the first place, is it about its routinization, the bureaucratization of the military industrial nuclear complex?
I mean, I think that is a big part of the story after the Manhattan Project ended. We had kind of set up this system of what are called national labs, which are a lot of them nuclear weapons labs, and there is a big infrastructure involved in that, and a lot of contractors involved in that, and then also on the Department of Defense side, which is in charge of the missiles and the submarines and the delivery systems for nuclear weapons. There's also the military and the industrial side of that. So it's kind of just grown in that kind of scope ever since.
And then tell me more about the book. It's a narrative of not just the future, but the present of nuclear weapons. How did you get access to some of the stuff that you write about?
Yeah, honestly, I just asked. I had been visiting the nuclear weapons labs for a couple of years, and I first went and learned about their basic science that they do, and physics or climate change or pandemic modeling or things like that, that all the science of that actually has some relevance to nuclear weapons in a weird way. And so I kind of just established myself with the labs, established that I wouldn't get the actual science wrong of what they were doing, and then I said, now I'm really interested in what you do that most of your money goes to and most of your focus is, which is nuclear weapons. And then, there were a lot of discussions and background checks for me to be able to interview people and go to the labs. But I think, right now, nuclear weapons are getting more funding than they have in the past. And I think that the labs, in some sense, have kind of a vested interest in opening the curtain a little bit more than they have in the past.
So what did you find? What have you found that will perhaps shock people, make them worried, or perhaps reassure them about the future of nuclear weapons, which hopefully won't be used by anybody?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think on the reassuring side is that all of these labs, and also institutions outside of them, are working on global security and non-proliferation. So trying to make sure that there are not more nuclear weapons than we think there are, and that they're not spreading. Making sure people are obeying treaties like our agreement not to test nuclear weapons or develop more nuclear weapons material than everyone has agreed to. And so there's a lot of very smart people working on those problems, weirdly at the same place where nuclear weapons are designed and upgraded, and things like that. But I think what on the scary side, what scared me is normally when you're talking to experts about something, they will tell you that what you see in the news or what you're worried about is a little hyped up, and you need to worry about it a little less than you thought. You don't need to be quite as afraid. But I would say that the people working on nuclear weapons are equally, if not more, afraid and cautious of some kind of nuclear incident happening in the not too distant future. And I think anytime you have experts who are also worried, that makes things even more worrisome.
Yeah, it is, of course. It goes without saying it's worrying. You wrote an interesting piece last August in the Times suggesting that nuclear war has returned to the realm of dinner table conversation, weighing on the minds of the public more than it has in a generation. But nuclear technology hasn't returned to the dinner table, has it? It's more the threat of war, perhaps, terrorism, the growing conflict between the US and China and Russia.
Right. Yeah, nuclear weapons kind of exist as, I think one scholar said to me, not so much as objects, but as this kind of abstract threat, because we haven't used them since the 1940s, and no one has, but they're kind of this looming threat in the background all the time. And so they're not so much objects as abstractions. And so I think that abstraction is definitely, I think, more on people's minds than it has been in the recent past. During the Cold War, I think it was more felt, just because there were these moments of large tension between the countries that did have nuclear weapons, and we're sort of back in a similar situation, particularly with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so I think it's something that's on people's minds. And like you mentioned, terrorism is on the minds of the people working on non-proliferation, who try to stop nuclear smuggling and the radiological black market and things like that. And no one has ever used a dirty bomb, but everyone is kind of constantly a little bit concerned about it.
You mentioned the return to the dinner table. Of course, in the past, the fear of nuclear war dominated the dinner table, particularly around the Cuban Missile Crisis. You mentioned Ukraine and Putin's threat. Sometimes it's hard to tell how serious he was to use nuclear weapons. Are there any equivalents between the tensions, the global tensions, the geopolitical tensions of the 2020s, and the kind of tensions that created the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Yeah, I mean, I think anytime there are countries that have nuclear weapons who are making moves of any sort that another country with nuclear weapons doesn't like, then you do kind of have this cold conflict going on where Russia's nuclear weapons, for instance, right now are, I think, influencing the actions of other countries in that no one wants to be the one who incites World War III or begins the part of the conflict that becomes nuclear. And so I think, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, it required a lot of trying to read each other's minds, countries trying to read each other's minds. And I think that is still going on right now. What is everyone's motivations? What do they want? How are they going to act? And that's always kind of opaque when you're outside the leadership of another country.
Well, Sarah, Scoles' book, Countdown, is anything but opaque. It appears, or it reveals, perhaps, or gets beyond the opaqueness of the nuclear missile industry in the United States. It's called The Blinding Future. The book is called Countdown, The Blinding Future of Nuclear Weapons. When it comes to clarity, I'm thrilled that this show is sponsored by Liberties, a quarterly journal of culture and politics. Doesn't deal much with nuclear weapons, but with many other issues. Going to run a short feature on Liberties, and then we'll be back with Sarah Scoles to talk more about nuclear weapons and whether or not we should be fearful of the future. So don't go away, anyone.
Beyond the news, the noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We're speaking with Sarah Scoles, the author of an important new book, Countdown, The Blinding Future of Nuclear Weapons. Sarah, you write extensively on technology, and you've written some interesting stuff about how the military is betting big on AI. How much is AI, and I use this word carefully, infiltrating nuclear technology and nuclear weapons?
I think that, in terms of being incorporated into things like nuclear launch protocols and, the process by which a nuclear weapon would be launched, that's, to my knowledge, not part of the process. So we're not talking about that. But I think on the early warning and intelligence analysis side, it's at least part of conversations of, taking satellite images or other sorts of intelligence and trying to analyze them. I think people are interested in using AI to understand, what other countries are doing in a nuclear manner. But the biggest place that I saw it actually was in a program called Stockpile Stewardship, which is basically, our nuclear weapons are fairly aged, and they need to be stewarded into the future, the thinking goes, to make sure that they are safe and secure and reliable, is the phrase that people like to use. And that involves really understanding the physics of what's going on inside of them and what would go on if one were launched. And we don't test them anymore, so that involves supercomputer simulations and small experiments. And I know that the National Nuclear Security Administration is interested in doing some testing on using artificial intelligence to help with some of those simulations to try to understand the weapons better. So, operationally, not so much, but on the back end of doing the science behind them, I think it's more in the works.
Some people will be chilled by this association of AI and nuclear weapons. What chills you most? What keeps you up at night in terms of researching this book and what you found?
I think what keeps me up at night is not so much the idea of a fully conscious and understandable start to a nuclear war, like a very clear, another country launches a nuclear weapon and we launch one back in response, but that kind of scenario arising from a misunderstanding. bad intelligence or a mistake of some sort. And I think, in history, there have been situations like that and we have so far avoided nuclear disaster. But I think that, the longer you avoid something, in some ways, the more likely it becomes, because you're just putting yourself in more situations of that sort. So I think if I had to pick one nuclear catastrophe that's scary, that would be mine.
As that famous bumper sticker in Berkeley said, one nuclear weapon can ruin your day and everybody's day. What about the politics of all this and the need for international regulation? Oppenheimer, one of the most memorable scenes in Oppenheimer was the one between Harry Truman and Oppenheimer, where Oppenheimer wanted to give Truman some advice on international regulation, and Truman wasn't particularly happy. What conclusions did you come to in Countdown about the need for more international regulation of the industry? Not just of the industry, but of course of relations between nuclear powers.
Yeah, I mean, I think nuclear weapons do have, more international agreements existing than some other kinds of weapons, and rightly so. They are more dangerous than other weapons are. But I think from that scene, the general lesson still rings true, which is that scientists who work on nuclear weapons may have a misplaced assessment of the amount of power that they have in terms of how they're used. Like Oppenheimer and other Manhattan Project scientists had ideas about nuclear policies, and the people who actually make the policies were not that interested in what they thought and were going to do what they were going to do regardless. I mean, I think, many nations have signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which essentially agrees if you don't have nuclear weapons right now, you agree not to acquire them. And the countries that do have nuclear weapons agree to kind of long-term decrease their reliance on those nuclear weapons. And I think right now the world doesn't really seem to be moving in that direction. So I would be interested in seeing how it can. And there are other things like arms control agreements, like the New START treaty, that are not being in. Russia has withdrawn from that treaty, and so I think getting back on the train of having international agreements about how many weapons we have and how they're used, I think would be a good start.
So the SALT treaties are positive models for how you can get to international agreement.
Yeah, I mean, I think they have been a good start to get countries to willingly agree to limit their power in some way. I think is an achievement.
What about, did you find anything about espionage? The narrative in Oppenheimer, of course, is dominated by the accusation that Oppenheimer might have been a communist spy. There were spies, Klaus Fuchs, for example. Is that still an issue in terms of a foreign power or foreign organization infiltrating the American nuclear arms industry?
I mean, I'm sure it is a constant worry and something that the National Nuclear Security Administration tries to guard against. I did not hear or see anything, about active worries about, spying going on right now. But, the labs are heavily guarded. There are limitations on, what work foreign nationals can do and where they can be in the laboratories. And so I think it remains a concern, but I don't know if I would be the one who would ever find out if there were more active concerns or things going on. But to my knowledge, I didn't see any of that.
You mentioned earlier the dirty bomb. What about rogue nations? North Korea, of course, comes to mind, Iran. Smaller countries like Israel already have the bomb, India, Pakistan. Is that something in your conversations with scientists and administrators that they're particularly fearful of?
Yeah, I think so, particularly for countries like North Korea that remain pretty opaque, not to use that word again, to the United States and from the outside in general, whose motivations and value systems might be very different from ours. It's hard to play the nuclear mind game with countries that are that different from us. And so I think, in at least in the beginning of the Cold War, when it was just, the United States and the Soviet Union who had nuclear weapons, that's complicated because they're catastrophic weapons. But in the end, it's just two countries with two fairly well understood sets of motivations and thinking patterns. And now there are many more nations, and like you said, some of them are a bit rogue, and that really complicates things, even just having more, but also having more different things going on.
Yeah, it's like a club which has suddenly closed its door. I mean, if the Israelis have one and the Indians and the Pakistanis have one, why shouldn't the Saudis or the Iranians have a weapon?
Right. And I mean, I think that's a question that countries that don't have nuclear weapons sometimes do ask themselves. If these countries that do have nuclear weapons, if they make them feel so safe and like they can deter conflict, why shouldn't we have the same thing?
Is there any possibility in the future? The subtitle of your book is about the nuclear future. Is it possible, Sarah, that in the future we can get rid of nuclear weapons? Can they be destroyed without actually blowing anyone up?
I think that's a future that a lot of people, obviously outside the nuclear complex, but also within the nuclear complex, would like to move toward. I do think that is the kind of thing that for sure requires international agreements. It's not like the United States or Russia or India or anyone would just give up their nuclear weapons unilaterally, lest they be on the wrong side of deterrence. But there are organizations like one called Global Zero that kind of have stepwise plans for how you could eliminate nuclear weapons without kind of taking a global order out of balance. And that does involve things like arms control, like agreeing that you will decrease your stockpile, agreeing that you will not use nuclear weapons first without being attacked in some way, and then verification that all of that is true. And so I think there are plans. It just kind of requires the will of all of the countries who would have to agree to that, which I don't see that happening in the near future, but maybe the longer term future.
And is there any credibility to the MAD argument, the mutually assured destruction argument, that the existence of these weapons has actually reduced the chances of, or eliminated the possibility of, a war between the superpowers, between the United States and China and Russia?
I mean, it is true that since the advent of nuclear weapons, the number of people killed in conflict, like compared to the total population of Earth, has decreased drastically since the end of World War II, even though obviously we still do have conflicts and too many people do die. And so, some people do attribute that to the existence of nuclear weapons. They stop large-scale conflict from breaking out. They may not stop smaller scale or regional conflict, but we haven't had a World War III with huge numbers of casualties, and that is because of nuclear weapons. On the other side of the argument, there's no way to prove that is because of nuclear weapons. And then there's also the argument that holding yourself at constant worldwide peril is not a great way to keep the peace, even if it has kept the peace so far, and all it would take would be one nuclear weapon for that not to be true anymore.
Ruin all of our days. Might even
Yes.
take my show off the air. Finally, you've written a couple of books, your previous books on extraterrestrials. They are already here. Another interesting book, Making Contact, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. If there is extraterrestrial intelligence, what do you think they or it or she would think about nuclear weapons?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the thinking among scientists who are trying to find aliens is that if they exist, chances are they're much older than us. And so if they are much older than us, they've they've probably made something like nuclear weapons and then figured out how to not kill each other with it. And so I would guess that if they're out there, they would probably tell us to, leave that one alone, or ourselves find a way to keep the peace without